Our story begins with a man waiting for the airport expansion. Officials were going door to door to measure houses for compensation, yet he waited 3 months. Not a single soul knocked on his door, and only later did he discover that on the planning map, his land had been intentionally excluded. Naturally, he went to find answers in a fit of rage, only to be told that the plan was final and nothing could be done. His neighbors even mocked him, saying he'd be stuck with that old house forever, but Fu Qing didn't just give up and complain. Instead, he took his life savings, secured a loan to reach 10 million, and 6 months later, his old house became a 10-story building. He hung a sign for the Cloud Hotel, and the no entry for non-customers notice became the most striking sight at the entire airport. We see that once news of the airport spread, our quiet town of Anning was no longer peaceful, as talk of compensation filled the air. Relocation and future lives became eternal topics, while white vans from the demolition office shuttled back and forth on the dirt roads. Staff members carried tape measures and notebooks to every house, and this is where we meet our protagonist, Fu Qing. He lived at the eastern edge of town in a 2-story old house. Since his parents passed away, he had lived there all alone. On the first day, the demolition office car drove right past his door. He assumed they were simply starting from the west side first. A week later, his neighbor Li Shen settled his deal for a large sum and couldn't stop smiling, loudly asking Fu Qing about his own progress. Fu Qing would just smile and nod, but by the first month, even the other eastern residents were signing their contracts one by one. Soon, the town walls were covered in the red character for Demolish, yet the walls of his own home remained strangely clean and gray. He began to feel a sense of panic as 2 more months passed, and most of the townspeople had already moved away. With an ominous feeling spreading in his heart, he went to the town government to find the mayor, Zheng Daqian, who was busy on the phone. When Fu Qing pushed the door open, the mayor only looked up with an impatient glance, asking what he wanted. Fu Qing asked directly about the airport demolition and why his house had been skipped, which made Zheng Daqian pause. The mayor slowly hung up the phone and pulled a massive planning map from his drawer, pointing toward a specific section. As Fu Qing leaned in to look, his heart sank. The red demolition line on the map curved around his home like a sharp blade. The line clung tightly to the edge of his courtyard wall, leaving his small building looking like a forgotten island. It sat all alone, cast outside the red boundary. He stared at that line, his voice trembling as he asked what had happened. He wondered if there had been a mistake, but Zheng Daqian's tone was ice-cold as he replied that there was no error. The mayor claimed the plan was set, and they were powerless, yet Fu Qing couldn't help but ask why the whole town was being demolished, except for his house. Zheng Daqian's voice suddenly rose with unquestionable authority, repeating that he had already explained the situation. He insisted it was the expert's decision and there was no way around it, before abruptly ending the meeting to attend another one. The mayor walked out, and as Fu Qing returned home, he ran into his neighbor Li Shun directing a moving company. Furniture was being loaded onto trucks, and seeing Fu Qing's soul-crushed expression, Li Shun couldn't hide a hint of gloating. He asked if Fu Qing had gotten his answers, but our protagonist remained silent, prompting the neighbor to curl his lip in disdain. Li Shun remarked that he knew this would happen, noting that Fu Qing's location was simply in a difficult spot for the developers. Since the house was right on the edge, it didn't obstruct anything. To them, paying compensation for it just wasn't worth the cost. Another neighbor leaned in to mock him, noting that soon he would be the only resident left in the entire town. He'd be stuck in that old house forever, surrounded by an airport where the noise would be absolutely deafening. Li Shun laughed even harder, adding that while they would all be living in new city apartments, the situation here would be quite different. He joked that Fu Qing would still be smelling airplane exhaust. Those harsh laughs stung like needles in his ears. But he didn't argue. He simply looked up in silence at the small building where he had grown up. Eventually, the moving trucks roared away, leaving him in the empty street to dial a number and call for Su Wan. He identified himself as Fu Qing, and from the other end, Su Wan's gentle voice replied with a hint of confusion. She wondered why he was calling so suddenly, and after a moment of silence, he explained he needed to consult her about a loan. Su Wan was a childhood friend who had studied finance and now worked as a relationship manager at a city bank. Su Wan sounded quite surprised as she asked why he needed a loan, but Fu Qing simply replied that everything was fine. He explained his plan to renovate the old family house, which only left Su Wan more confused by the sudden idea. She pointed out that the whole area was being demolished for the airport, so he briefly explained the strange situation. After hearing that his house was excluded, Su Wan fell silent before her voice flared with anger at the blatant unfairness. She couldn't believe the planning map would conveniently skip just one house, but Fu Qing remained remarkably calm about it. Whether it was a coincidence or not didn't matter anymore. Su Wan then asked what he actually intended to do. As he looked out at the empty land, he told her he wasn't just going to sit and watch that old house. He intended to tear it down and rebuild it entirely, leaving Su Wan silent for a long moment before asking if he was sure. This would be a massive investment, but he firmly stated he had made up his mind and needed a 300,000 yuan loan. Combined with his savings, he would have 500,000. Hearing that number, Su Wan could hardly believe her ears. She gasped, asking if he had lost his mind, as that seemed like far too much money just to rebuild a private home. But he wasn't building an ordinary house. He looked toward the horizon where the massive airport would soon be bustling with people. His home would be the closest and only private building near the airport, a fact that changed the entire equation. He asked her what she thought about the prospects of opening a hotel right next to the future international hub. Soo-won was stunned into silence. Being a sharp professional, she immediately grasped the scale of his ambition. She worried he was taking too big a leap, questioning if he had the management experience or the connections for such a risk. Faced with her genuine concern, he decided to ask her a question of his own to test the logic. Soo-won remained worried, noting that his old house might not be enough collateral for such a significant sum of money. He interrupted before she could finish, admitting that his lack of income proof was exactly why he had called her. He knew he was putting her in a difficult position, but to be honest, he had no other path left to take. He told her this was his only chance to change his fate, prompting Soo-won to sigh and remark that Fu-ching hadn't changed at all. She joked that he was always quiet until he said something shocking, then told him to bring his property deed and documents to her office tomorrow. She promised to help him find a way forward, though she couldn't guarantee success, and Fu-ching thanked her with genuine gratitude. To lighten the mood, she made a small joke, telling him not to thank her just yet, at least not until his hotel was open. She asked for a lifetime free stay in a presidential suite, and he seriously agreed. So, at dawn the next day, our journey truly began. Carrying all his hopes, he squeezed onto the first bus to the city, where Soo-won immediately began reviewing his paperwork with focused intensity. She made countless calls and took him to various departments, where bank auditors looked at his property deed, the one excluded from the demolition zone. They all wore expressions of pure disbelief, seeing a lone house surrounded by an airport as a risk that was, frankly, absurdly high. Time and again, he had to explain his business plan, but they looked at this quiet, somewhat reserved young man with nothing but doubt. There were moments during that period when he felt he couldn't go on, but fortunately, Soo-won was always there to encourage him. She didn't just refine his business plan, she taught him how to communicate with bankers and even utilized her own professional network. She even invited branch leaders to dinner, and a week later, just as he was beginning to lose hope, Soo-won called him. Her voice on the other end sounded exhausted, but we can hear the underlying excitement as she called out his name. She told him they had won the fight, and Fu-ching, unable to hide his agitation, asked if it was really true. It was true. 300,000 yuan would be dispersed within a week, a result that seemed almost like a miracle. She explained that she had practically signed a military pledge with her governor to push his specific project through the system. She had framed it as a key, innovative pilot project for the year, which was the only way she managed to convince her superiors. He held the phone in silence for a long time as tears welled up without warning, and he could only manage to whisper her name. He thanked her again, but Soo-won simply laughed and called him a fool, asking why he was being so formal with her. He immediately promised to take her out to dinner once the money arrived, but Soo-won just smiled and said that wouldn't be necessary. She told him to hurry up and build that hotel because she was waiting for her suite, and after hanging up, he walked to the window. Watching the construction begin outside, he knew this wasn't just his net worth, it was his entire life's gamble. He whispered to himself that there was no turning back now. He had to win, there was no other option. The day after the funds arrived, he immediately reached out to the best architectural firm in the city and hired the town's most famous construction crew, led by a man named Captain Zhao. Zhao was an honest man who, upon seeing the old family house, couldn't help but scratch his head and ask if Fu-ching really meant to demolish it. Fu-ching confirmed it, prompting Captain Zhao to ask what he planned to build, noting that the entire surrounding area would soon be an airport. He calmly pulled out a set of blueprints and told Uncle Zhao not to worry, as he had already commissioned a professional design. Captain Zhao took the blueprints, and after just one glance, his eyes widened in pure shock. "Good heavens," he muttered. He noted it was 4 stories with a basement and a viewing terrace, practically a luxury villa. Fu-ching simply replied that it wasn't a villa. It was a hotel. Captain Zhao and the workers behind him stood there in complete silence, utterly stunned by the word hotel. They were dazed, their expressions mirroring exactly what the bank auditors had looked like before. Captain Zhao couldn't help but feel a lingering doubt. He looked at Fu-ching's determined eyes and fell silent, staring at the blueprints for a long time before looking back at the house's location. Slowly, his gaze shifted. He slapped his thigh as a realization dawned on him, exclaiming that he finally understood Fu-ching's vision. He praised the young man's cleverness, struggling to find the right words, repeating "this is called" over and over as he searched for the term. He kept stammering, trying to describe the brilliance of the plan, his excitement growing even as the words failed him momentarily. It was a moment of pure, stuttering realization as the scale of the ambition finally started to sink in for the veteran builder. He continued to fumble for the right vocabulary, clearly impressed by the audacity of building a hotel right in the middle of an airport's path. The workers watched their captain, who was still caught in a loop of disbelief and sudden, frantic admiration for the boy's strategy. He kept repeating the phrase, his mind racing to categorize this unprecedented project that defied all local logic. Finally, he settled on trying to describe the unique constraints and the sheer genius of the location's potential. Captain Zhao struggled to find the right words, stammering that this plan was simply, well, it was something else entirely. He kept repeating this is called, as he searched his mind for the right technical term for such a bold move. Fu Qing simply watched him, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction that, as of today, the first part of the plan was finally in motion. He told the crew to use the materials they had and to start immediately, and soon, the heavy machinery roared to life. As the work began, several neighbors who hadn't moved out yet gathered around, eager to see what all the commotion was about. We see the old house, filled with childhood memories, collapse under the weight of the bulldozer, drawing gasps from the watching crowd. The neighbors whispered that Fu Qing must be truly mad, tearing down a perfectly good house without a second thought. A man named Li Shun stood by with his arms crossed, sneering that he'd heard Fu Qing brought a fortune to build a Western-style villa. He mocked the idea, suggesting she had more money than sense and wondering what would happen once the building was actually finished. Others chimed in, asking if she wouldn't be terrified living in such a massive, lonely house all by herself at night. They joked that with no neighbors around, it would be like living in a graveyard, a classic case of vanity leading to suffering. They wondered if defying the urban planning office would end poorly, but Fu Qing remained completely unfazed by their idle gossip. Standing before the ruins, he watched the workers intently until the commotion eventually drew the attention of the town mayor, Zheng Daqian. The mayor watched from his car, likely surprised that instead of coming to him in tears, Fu Qing was making such a bold scene. Zheng Daqian rolled down his window and called out to him, and Fu Qing walked over calmly to ask if there was a problem. The mayor's tone was accusatory as he demanded to know what he was doing, to which Fu Qing replied he was simply renovating. Zheng Daqian pressed further, asking why a renovation required a total demolition and if he even had the proper permits for a reconstruction. To the mayor's visible frustration, Fu Qing produced the paperwork, and after seeing how complete it was, Zheng threw the files back. His voice turned threatening as he warned that the airport construction was a serious matter and not something to be trifled with. He told Fu Qing that any interference or illegal building would be met with harsh consequences, while Fu Qing calmly tucked his documents away. Fu Qing looked the mayor straight in the eye, assuring him that every single one of his actions fell strictly within the law. He stated he wouldn't interfere with anyone and expected the same in return, a level of toughness Zheng Daqian had likely never encountered. Ultimately, the mayor let out a heavy grunt and rolled up his window to drive away, though Fu Qing knew this visit was a warning. It was a test of his resolve, and in the following days, he practically lived at the construction site as the building's frame began to rise. On that empty land, the structure grew visibly every day. By the end of the first month, the foundation and basement were complete. By the second month, the main structure was topped off, and finally, the last truck of concrete was poured onto the fourth-floor roof. Captain Zhao celebrated by setting off firecrackers, while Fu Qing stood on the raw rooftop, looking down at the land beneath his feet. From there, the silhouette of the distant airport was becoming clearer. His hotel and the future terminal were now in a silent race. It was a contest to see which would be revealed to the world first, but while he was discussing wall materials with the designer, a fleet of law enforcement vehicles suddenly roared onto the scene, and a dozen officials stepped out of their cars. They wore uniforms from various departments, led by a middle-aged man, with Zheng Daqian following closely behind with a faint, cold smirk. The lead official demanded to know who was in charge here, his voice sharp and full of practiced authority. Fu Qing stepped forward to identify himself, only to have the man flash an ID and announce they were a joint enforcement task force. They claimed to have received reports of serious construction violations, safety hazards, and environmental pollution, and Fu Qing knew the real trouble had arrived. Zheng Daqian remained silent, but the gloating look in his eyes told the whole story. To be honest, he wasn't even trying to hide it. Facing the group, Fu Qing calmly replied that all their permits were legal and the work followed every national standard. The official snapped back that legality wasn't for Fu Qing to decide and immediately ordered his team to begin the inspection. He told them to check every single detail, leaving no stone unturned in their search for a mistake. We see the officials swarm the site, some checking fire safety, others measuring noise levels or taking air samples for testing. Others pored over the construction logs. Captain Zhao and the workers were stunned, but Fu Qing held them back from interfering. He let them search, knowing deep down that this was simply Zheng Daqian's revenge. In moments like these, he knew he couldn't afford to lose his cool. For the rest of the afternoon, the construction site ground to a halt as the officials found endless ways to be difficult. They claimed the rebar spacing looked wrong and demanded measurements, then insisted the dust control measures were inadequate and deserved a fine. They even demanded the cafeteria's health permit, while Zheng Daqian frequently leaned in to whisper into the lead official's ear. The two of them kept casting malicious glances in his direction, but Fu Qing remained perfectly silent throughout the ordeal. Instead, he used his phone to discreetly record every single movement and every face on the scene, continuing until the sun began to set. After turning the entire site upside down, the group finally gathered together for the middle-aged official to deliver his summary. He announced that after a detailed afternoon inspection, the site was found to be basically in compliance with the regulations. It was clear he hated saying those words, and Fu Qing finally felt a sense of relief. He had prepared for this. From the moment he decided to build the hotel, he had pushed every detail to the limit, even hiring the best supervision firm available. He had demanded quality certificates for every batch of materials and ensured every phase of construction followed the blueprints to the letter. His goal was to create a building that no one could find fault with, and seeing the result, Zhang Daqian's face turned incredibly sour. Evidently, the man hadn't expected a young man in his 20s to be so thorough and leave absolutely no room for error. However, the official suddenly shifted his tone, noting that because the site was adjacent to the airport project, the situation was special. To ensure total safety, they ordered a one-week work stoppage for a self-inspection, a move that finally made Captain Zhao shout in anger. The official immediately pulled a stern face, ready to assert his authority over the shouting foreman. But as Fu Qing looked at that greasy, arrogant face, he suddenly broke into a calm smile. To be honest, it was almost a laugh. He mentioned that he had just sent the video he recorded to a friend who worked for the provincial media. He asked them to imagine what would happen if the public saw exactly how this afternoon had played out. He was, after all, just a man trying to protect his home. He called himself a simple citizen with no power, forced to use such clumsy methods to defend himself, and at those words, the official's smile instantly froze. The official stared at him in utter shock, his eyes filled with disbelief. He likely never imagined this outcome in his wildest dreams. In his eyes, Fu Qing was just a weak, defenseless orphan, yet here he was, hiding such a powerful trump card. The middle-aged official sensed the atmosphere shifting and quickly walked over to ask, "Mayor Zhang, how should we handle this?" Zhang Daqian shot him a fierce glare and, through gritted teeth, finally ordered them to let the construction continue. Without looking back, he climbed into his car and led his so-called enforcement team away in a pathetic, hurried retreat. A sudden cheer erupted across the construction site as Captain Zhao and the workers gave Fu Qing a thumbs up in admiration. They called him impressive, but only Fu Qing knew that his bold words were only half true. He had recorded the video, certainly. However, the friend in the media was a total bluff. He was gambling that Zhang Daqian's guilty conscience would keep him from escalating things. He had won the gamble, but knowing the man wouldn't let this go, he looked toward the distant city lights and took out his phone. He called Suwan and told her he might be in big trouble, explaining everything that had happened that afternoon. There was a long silence on her end, leading him to ask if she was still there. Her voice sounded tired, yet remarkably steady. She told him not to panic, to which he replied that he wasn't panicking. He simply wanted to know what his next move should be. Suwan began to analyze the situation, noting that going head-to-head with the man on his own turf would only lead to a loss. He was certain they would suffer a loss and insisted on a change of plans. When asked for a new strategy, he simply quoted the art of war. All warfare is based on deception. Since his permits were in order and everything was legal, that served as his direct force, his solid foundation. Because Zhang Daqian couldn't find a legitimate flaw, he was forced to use dirty tactics. Therefore, they needed a different approach. They needed to launch a surprise attack from a direction the man would never expect. And as Fu Qing listened, his chaotic thoughts began to clear. When he asked what this surprise attack was, Suwan answered slowly and clearly. The airport, the Anning International Airport project itself. Fu Qing was stunned for a moment, but she continued, asking him what the core competitiveness of his future hotel truly was. It was its unique location and its zero-distance proximity to the airport. From now on, he couldn't just limit his vision. She explained that he couldn't just focus on this tiny plot of land in Anning Town, nor could he keep obsessing over a clown like Zhang Daqian. He needed to raise his perspective to match the scale of the airport project itself, finding a way to make the developers see him as one of their own. Suwan's words were like a bolt of lightning, instantly clearing the fog in his mind as he realized why Zhang Daqian felt so comfortable bullying him. It was because, in the official's eyes, he was just a lone individual. However, if he could somehow bind himself to a giant entity like the airport, then Zhang Daqian would have to think twice before acting. But the real question, of course, was how to create such a bond. Fu Qing admitted his hesitation, noting that the airport was a major provincial project and the people in charge were far above his station. He felt he had no way to even reach them, but Suwan simply laughed and asked who said anything about contacting the top leadership directly. She asked him if he had forgotten his own greatest advantage, leaving Fu Qing to wonder what that could possibly be. Suwan quickly explained that, aside from the airport itself, his construction site was the only place in Anning Town where a large crowd gathered. We see her point. The airport site had thousands of workers, and all of them needed a place to eat and basic necessities. Their lives were likely dull and inconvenient, and here he was, positioned right next door to them. A perfectly timed opportunity, one might say. He understood her meaning instantly and asked if she wanted him to start a business catering to them, hearing a hint of excitement in her voice. She told him it was more than just business. It was his best chance to integrate himself into the entire airport project ecosystem. He could use his current site to open a small, temporary service area, a canteen, a convenience store, or even an open-air cinema. The investment would be small, but it would solve the immediate needs of the workers by providing convenience and care rather than just goods. Fu Qing was genuinely impressed, calling her a genius, though Su-won just laughed it off in her usual steady manner. She claimed she wasn't the genius, but rather that he had inspired her by choosing to build his hotel right next to the airport in the first place. She reminded him that by solving the workers' daily struggles, he wasn't just selling products. He was building a reputation among thousands of men. When those thousands of workers began to rely on his kindness, she asked how he thought the airport's construction leaders would view him then. They would see him as a visionary partner, an ally who could stabilize their rear guard and handle their logistical headaches without being asked. By that time, she noted, his hotel would no longer be just a lonely, isolated building standing in the middle of nowhere. Su-won continued her advice, reminding him that a person capable of building such a hotel couldn't possibly be a fool. She urged him to act quickly, positioning their pieces on the board before Jung Daekian had a chance to make his next move. When Fu Qing asked what his first step should be, she suggested he find Uncle Zhao, whose workers had the skills to build a temporary shelter. Setting up a large food stall would be easy for him, and for supplies, she promised to provide contact numbers for reliable city wholesalers. She emphasized that these were her trusted clients, but the price must be fair. They weren't seeking quick profit, but rather the people's hearts. After hanging up, he felt every cell in his body come alive, as the previous exhaustion and confusion completely vanished. In their place was an unprecedented sense of hope. That very night, he found Uncle Zhao and shared the new plan with him. Uncle Zhao slapped his thigh in excitement, praising the idea and admitting he had been feeling sorry for the brothers at the airport site. Those poor men were stuck eating cafeteria food every day until they were sick of it. A food stall was exactly what they needed. With some beer and skewers, they would be overjoyed. Uncle Zhao patted his chest, personally guaranteeing the project's success. True to his word, Uncle Zhao's efficiency was staggering. 3 days later, a structure made of steel pipes and color-coded sheets stood ready. A large, simple plaza had emerged, which Fu Qing decided to name the gas station, a place to refuel both the workers and his own spirit. Meanwhile, Jung Daekian's spies were watching from the shadows, utterly confused as to why he was building a shed instead of a hotel. The grand opening of the food stall arrived quickly, and we see Fu Qing holding a small, modest ceremony to mark the occasion. He posted a sign in bold red letters at the entrance. For the first 3 days, all food and drinks would be half price. He even had Uncle Zhao send workers to the airport gates to hand out flyers. As evening approached, the sky began to dim. When the end-of-shift bell rang at the airport site, hundreds of workers poured out of the gates like a rising tide. Most were covered in dust and looked exhausted, but they stopped in their tracks when they saw the bright lights nearby. The aroma of roasted meat and stir-fry drifted through the air, leaving them wondering what this lively new place could possibly be. It looks like a place to eat, something called the gas station, someone suggested as the crowd gathered. They decided to take a look, and our first customer was a very young man who called out for the boss. When he asked if everything was truly half price, Fu Qing answered with a smile that it certainly was. Fu Qing personally headed to the kitchen, working with impressive speed to bring out a steaming, generous portion of rice. The young man's eyes widened at the mountain of pork before him, and soon, a second and third customer arrived. Within an hour, the entire gas station was packed with people sitting in groups, ordering small dishes and crates of beer. The frustrations they had suppressed all day at the construction site were finally released, fueled by alcohol and good food. The night, once empty and silent, was suddenly ignited by a boisterous energy that felt truly alive. Uncle Zhao and his workers were there too, their faces flushed from drinking. The first step of the plan was a success. Over the following days, business at the gas station became increasingly explosive, turning the humble shed into a local sensation. It became the only sanctuary and paradise for the workers in their otherwise dull lives at the airport site. However, the atmosphere shifted when a few strangers entered, causing the dining workers to frown as they sensed trouble. Fu Qing emerged from the kitchen, untying his apron and calmly asking the aggressive-looking men what they wanted to eat. The leader confirmed Fu Qing was the boss and bluntly stated they weren't there to eat, but to collect protection money. He held up 5 fingers, claiming that to do business in Anning Town, one had to follow their rules and pay up monthly. Before Fu Qing could even respond, a burly man at a nearby table suddenly stood up with a heavy thud. This was a contractor from the airport site named Zhang, a man who had become a regular at the stall. Contractor Zhang asked in a low, menacing voice what they thought they were doing there. The other workers looked on with furrowed brows, clearly seeing that these thugs had come specifically to cause trouble. Fu Qing remained composed in front of the counter, watching to see exactly where these uninvited guests intended to take things. The leader, a man named Zheng Qi, looked around with a sneer, clearly unimpressed by the humble surroundings. He and his lackeys sat down as if they owned the place, while one of them, a man named Randy, began to eye the crowd. Zheng Qi made it clear that if things were to continue here, they would have to do things his way. He looked at Fu Qing with a cold, demanding gaze that expected immediate submission. It was obvious they were looking for trouble, or perhaps just an easy payday from a new business. As the tension rose, a young worker tried to speak up, only to be told harshly to stay out of it. The thugs threatened to settle the score with everyone at once, but contractor Zhang simply laughed and picked up an empty beer bottle. With a casual squeeze, the glass bottle shattered into countless pieces right in his hand, a display of raw, effortless strength. We see the smiles on Zheng Qi and his men instantly freeze as workers began to rise from every corner of the room. Dozens of burly men stood up, some gripping glass bottles and others reaching for heavy wrenches or wooden planks. Without saying a single word, they silently surrounded Zheng Qi's group, forming a wall of muscle and grit. These men had spent their lives working hard labor on construction sites, and while they were simple people, they lived by a strict code of loyalty. Because Fu Qing provided them with good, affordable food, they were more than willing to stand up for him when it mattered. Zheng Qi and his small-time thugs were used to bullying honest townsfolk, but they had never faced a crowd like this before. Trembling with a mix of fear and false bravado, Zheng Qi shouted, asking what they thought they were doing and mentioning his uncle, Zheng Daqian. Contractor Zhang spat on the ground with utter disdain, asking if Zheng Daqian was really supposed to be someone important. He mockingly asked if the boy's father was the Jade Emperor himself before telling them to get out before things got violent. Zheng Qi wanted to throw out one last threat, but seeing the circle of workers tightening around him, his courage completely vanished. He and his lackeys scrambled away as fast as they could, followed by a sudden burst of mocking laughter from the crowd. Fu Qing watched their pathetic retreat, then looked at the workers who had protected him, feeling a genuine wave of warmth in his heart. And so, we see Fu Qing walk over and give a deep, respectful bow to Contractor Zhang and the other workers, thanking them for their help. Contractor Zhang simply waved his hand with a hearty laugh, telling him there was no need for thanks since they just couldn't stand those lowlifes. He declared that they would protect this place, and if anyone dared to cause trouble for Boss Fu again, they would be picking a fight with all several thousand of their brothers, a statement that was met with a roar of agreement from everyone around. Standing there in the center of the crowd, Fu Qing looked at those honest, sincere faces and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Meanwhile, watching from a distance, Zheng Daqian saw his nephew being chased away like a stray dog and began to tremble with pure rage. It was at this moment he realized things were spiraling out of his control and that the orphan he had always looked down upon had grown wings far stronger than he ever imagined. Not far away, the main structure of Fu Qing's four-story building was finally complete. As it waited for its exterior decorations, he already had a name chosen for it, the Cloud Hotel. Deep down, he was determined to make everyone who had ever belittled him look up from the ground in awe of his success. After Zheng Qi and his men fled in disgrace, the atmosphere at the gas station reached an unprecedented peak of excitement. Contractor Zhang slapped a stack of money onto the table, telling Fu Qing that if he respected them at all, he would take his money back. He made it clear they hadn't helped him just to get a cheap meal or take advantage of his kindness. In that moment, Fu Qing realized he had gained something far more valuable than money. He had truly won the hearts of these men. Word of the incident quickly reached the ears of the Airport Project Command Center, and at first, the officials were quite nervous. To them, thousands of workers gathering at an uncontrolled private location seemed like a massive security risk. The project department reportedly held an emergency meeting overnight, where someone suggested shutting down Fu Qing's gas station immediately. They wanted to force all the workers back to the closed construction site, but the head of the construction team fiercely opposed the idea. He argued that locking them up would only cause tension and pressure to build until a major disaster eventually occurred. After a long and heated debate, a compromise was finally proposed. Rather than treating the place as a threat, instead, they decided to turn him into a controlled partner. Soon, an off-road vehicle bearing the plates of the Anning Airport Construction Command Center pulled up right in front of the construction site. A man in his 30s stepped out and walked straight toward Fu Qing with a polite smile. He asked if he was speaking to Boss Fu Qing. Fu Qing, feeling a bit wary, confirmed his identity, and the man reached out to introduce himself. He introduced himself as Qin Shou, the deputy director of logistics for the airport project, and asked if they could speak for a moment. After a brief hesitation, we see them sit down together at an empty table by the gas station. Fu Qing poured him a cup of herbal tea and waited. He asked Director Qin what business he had with him. Qin Shou simply smiled, his expression warm, and told Boss Fu not to be so nervous. He explained that he hadn't come to cause any trouble. Rather, he was there because he wanted to discuss a business deal. Fu Qing was stunned by the word cooperation and asked for clarification. Qin Shou adjusted his glasses and got straight to the point. He explained that after careful study, the department agreed that the gas station had contributed significantly to the steady progress of the airport project. They were truly grateful to him for providing such an excellent leisure area for the workers, a rare kindness in such a high-pressure environment. They wanted to sign a formal cooperation agreement where the command center would officially authorize his gas station to become the #1 life services area for the Anning International Airport project. They offered to provide official signage and a monthly subsidy, with only one specific requirement in return. Fu Qing felt his heart begin to race as he asked what that requirement was. Qin Shou looked at him. His eyes filled with sincerity and told him they simply needed him to guarantee food safety and price stability. They wanted the workers to eat happily and without worry. He noted that they knew Fu Qing's current prices left him with almost no profit. The subsidy was meant to ensure he could sustain this long term. By stabilizing the rear, the workers could focus on construction at the front lines. As he looked at the word cooperation on the agreement, Fu Qing felt his eyes grow warm. Su Wan's clever strategy, that brilliant, unconventional move, had ultimately succeeded in a way he had never even dared to imagine. He hadn't just become an ally to the project, he was now an officially certified partner. Without a second thought, he gave his answer. He agreed immediately, picking up the pen to sign his name, as Qin Shou happily tucked the agreement away. Qin Shou told him it was a pleasure doing business, adding that if he ever needed help or faced harassment, he should call. After seeing Qin Shou off, he immediately called Su Wan, his voice trembling with excitement as he told her they had succeeded. Su Wan laughed softly on the other end, telling him she had known all along and urging him to remember this lesson. She explained that when one provides value others cannot refuse, they become a partner everyone wants to recruit. He was no longer an ant to be stepped on. His battlefield had officially upgraded. And sure enough, the very next day, a brand new blue sign was hung in the most prominent spot at the gas station, bearing 2 lines of bold characters. It read, Designated Life Services Area for the Anning International Airport Project, authorized by the Logistics Department. The sign acted like a general's command flag. The moment it went up, the entire atmosphere of the station shifted. We see the workers standing a bit taller as they look at it. Dining here was no longer just a meal, but an official perk. With this, his identity transformed from a controversial small business owner into a legitimate, state-backed entrepreneur. He could clearly sense that the watchful, predatory eyes of Zheng Daqian had pulled back significantly after seeing that sign. For at least the following week, not a single incident of harassment occurred, a rare moment of peace, to be honest. Both the construction site and the station enjoyed this brief respite, though he knew it was merely the calm before the storm. A man like Zheng Daqian would never simply give up, and predictably, trouble arrived a week later in an unexpected way. That morning, Old Li, the truck driver who usually delivered the pork, approached him with a face full of misery. He apologized to boss Fu Qing, explaining with a heavy heart that today's meat delivery wouldn't be arriving. Fu Qing felt his heart sink and hurriedly asked what had happened. Old Li lit a cigarette, took a deep drag, and sighed. He explained that while hauling goods at dawn, he was intercepted by town transport officials claiming he had a violation. Despite being under the weight limit, they demanded a 10,000 yuan fine or threatened to impound his truck for a month. Hearing this, Fu Qing felt his heart sink instantly. He knew this was no coincidence, but a new tactic from Zheng Daqian. Since he didn't dare move against Fu Qing directly, he targeted the supply chain instead. Old Li added helplessly that he wasn't the only one. That morning, several trucks delivering vegetables, oil, and grain were intercepted at different intersections for various absurd reasons. From improper positioning to random fines and impoundments, the local drivers were now terrified to make deliveries to the station. Not a single one dared to come anymore. It was a classic move to cut off his resources, and a very effective one, to be honest. The gas station consumed massive amounts of food daily. If the supply chain broke, they would have to close within 2 days. By noon, the impact of the shortages became painfully clear. Several workers tried to order specific dishes, but they simply couldn't be made. Although the workers were understanding, Fu Qing could see the disappointment in their eyes, and deep down, he was growing increasingly anxious. He immediately called Qin Shou to explain the situation, and on the other end of the line, Qin Shou was absolutely furious. He called it outrageous, claiming this nonsense was actively sabotaging the normal operations of the entire airport project. He promised to negotiate with the town officials immediately, but an hour later, he called back with a helpless sigh for Fu Qing. He had spoken to them, and while they promised to fix it, the subordinates were just putting on a show while continuing the checkpoints. It was local protectionism at its worst, and as the headquarters, they had no direct administrative authority over the local town officials. They were playing games and stalling. Fu Qing realized he couldn't rely on others. He had to find a way to break through himself. He quickly dialed Su Wan, asking if she still had the contact information for the city's wholesale markets she had mentioned before. Su Wan responded immediately, confirming she had them, but asking with concern what had happened to cause such a sudden request. He briefly explained Zheng Daqian's latest scheme and the desperate situation the gas station was currently facing. After a few seconds of silence, Su Wan remarked that it was a ruthless move designed to drive him into a corner. She asked what he planned to do, noting that city deliveries were far away, costs would rise, and he didn't even have a vehicle. He told her he could rent or buy a used truck. The higher costs didn't matter, as Director Qin's subsidies could cover the difference. He firmly told her that he wanted full control over his supply chain, refusing to let anyone hold him by the throat ever again. Su Wan's voice held a note of genuine admiration as she told him not to worry about the vehicle. She had a client in the used car business. She promised to handle the paperwork and even cover the initial cost, while also calling the wholesale market to ensure he received the best goods. She reminded Fu Qing that Anning Town was just a small pond, and while Zheng Daqian was a big fish there, he was nothing outside of it. Her advice was simple. He needed to plant his roots in the vast rivers and seas beyond that tiny, restricted pond. These words were a revelation for him. He had been so focused on fighting within the town that he forgot he could simply bypass it entirely. 2 days later, we see a slightly worn blue truck pulling up right in front of the construction site entrance. Soo-won had driven it there herself, and as she handed him the keys, she asked if he had a driver's license. He confidently replied that he'd earned it in college, though he hadn't driven in a while, which, naturally, was a bit of a concern. Soo-won laughed it off, telling him the truck was durable, before opening the back to reveal it was packed to the brim. She explained that she had picked up the first batch of goods from the wholesale market on her way over for him to inspect. Looking at the fresh ingredients and the travel-worn Soo-won, Fu-ching felt a lump in his throat and struggled to find words. She quickly patted his shoulder, telling him to skip the sentimentality and start unloading since the workers were waiting to eat. She joked that he could pay her back by saving a few presidential suites for her once his hotel finally opened its doors. That evening, the meals at the gas station were more abundant than ever before, and word quickly spread among the men. When the workers learned that Fu-ching had personally driven dozens of kilometers to the city for these supplies, they were stunned. Foreman Zhang approached him with a bowl of wine, his face flushed with emotion as he admitted he rarely respected anyone this much. He declared that they were all with him now, and that this gas station had become a home they were willing to defend. Suddenly, hundreds of workers joined in, their voices rising in a unified shout that this was their home and no one would touch it. In that moment, we realized that Jung Daekian's ruthless attempt to starve them out had completely and utterly failed. Instead of crushing him, Jung Daekian had inadvertently forged an unbreakable bond between Fu-ching and these honest workers. With his own truck and an independent supply chain finally secured, the gas station's foundation was now rock solid. He poured all his energy back into the hotel's construction, and the designer Soo-won found was truly top tier. She designed a modern, minimalist style for the hotel that stood out sharply against the chaotic backdrop of the construction site. It looked like a piece of art dropped from a future city. Meanwhile, he opened a small supermarket on the premises. He began selling cigarettes, snacks, and daily necessities, even going so far as to install several washing machines. By providing laundry services, his gas station had effectively transformed into a fully functional, miniature community. It perfectly solved every lingering concern the airport workers had, and soon, word of his reputation began to spread. Through the workers' praise, everyone on the project learned of the young, capable boss named Fu-ching. One day, while he was balancing the books, Chin-sho suddenly walked in leading a small group of people. The leader was a middle-aged man in his 40s, flanked by 2 young assistants carrying notebooks and cameras. Chin-sho introduced them enthusiastically, identifying the man as the project development manager from Southern Airlines headquarters. This was manager Chun Mo, who was conducting a preliminary survey for future airline operations, a detail that made Fu-ching's heart race. He immediately stood up to shake hands, meeting Chun Mo's professional, businesslike smile with his own. Chun Mo remarked that he had heard much about him, noting that Director Chin hadn't stopped praising him all the way there. Fu-ching modestly brushed off the compliment, and Chun Mo quickly got straight to the point of their visit. He explained that while touring the airport site, they had spotted his strikingly designed building from a distance. Director Chin had told them it was a hotel nearing its grand opening, and Chun Mo asked if he was indeed the owner. When Fu-ching confirmed this, Chun Mo asked for a tour, a request that was granted without a moment's hesitation. And so, setting aside his ledgers, he led them toward the hotel, while Chun Mo began asking a series of pointed questions. His answers were calm and clear as he led them into the hotel lobby, which, despite still being under renovation, left them all visibly stunned. Standing there, we see the distant construction site where rows of cranes were busy at work, making it easy to imagine the near future. From this vantage point, one would see silver planes taking off, a visual impact that was truly unparalleled. Manager Chun Mo couldn't help but offer a sincere compliment, telling Fu-ching that he was quite impressed by his vision. While everyone else was focused on immediate demolition payouts, he had seen the future value. Meanwhile, the assistants were busy. They kept taking photos and notes as we moved to the rooftop observation deck, where the entire scene opened up before us. The entire airport construction site was visible from there, and Chun Mo looked into the distance as he began to speak about his airline's crew. He explained that after every flight mission, their crew members needed a place to rest, and their standards for partner hotels were exceptionally high. Safety, privacy, and convenience were all non-negotiable, and this hotel possessed a unique, natural advantage in its geographic location. It was the closest building to the airport, even closer than their planned staff dormitories, and he turned to look at Fu-ching. With a certain spark in his eyes, he asked if Fu-ching would be interested, once the hotel opened, in a specific proposal. He wanted to know if the hotel could become the designated layover residence for Southern Airlines crew at Anning Airport. Hearing this, Fu-ching felt his heart skip a beat, knowing that a long-term cooperation agreement with an airline was a massive opportunity. It meant that even before opening, his hotel would have the most stable and high-quality clientele imaginable, a dream come true, really. Suppressing his inner excitement, he replied that he was certainly interested, and Chun Imo nodded with a satisfied smile. He promised that once construction was finished, a professional team would conduct an evaluation to finalize a strategic partnership. After that, he pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it over, suggesting they stay in touch before the group departed. Fu Qing stood alone on the rooftop for a while, feeling the wind and wondering if it was all a dream, until he prepared to head down. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of a car parked on the distant road. It was Zheng Daqian's vehicle. Zheng Daqian was sitting inside with another person, appearing to point toward the hotel while saying something to his companion. And so, we see Fu Qing calmly walking downstairs as he sends a message to Su Wan, asking her to look into someone for him. Using his phone, he zoomed in from the rooftop to snap a blurry photo of the two men in the distance, adding a follow-up note. He specified that he wanted every detail possible on the man in the suit sitting next to Zheng Daqian. Su Wan replied almost instantly. She acknowledged the request, sensing trouble, and he replied that this might be the real thing before walking to the construction gate. He approached Uncle Zhao, asking for a favor, and the older man immediately agreed, waiting to hear what Fu Qing needed. Fu Qing explained that he needed a sign made from the finest wood and hand-carved, prompting Uncle Zhao to ask what it should say. Taking out a pen and paper, he carefully wrote down the specific words he wanted displayed for everyone to see. The sign read, "Non-paying guests are strictly prohibited from entering." Uncle Zhao stared at the words for a moment, surprised. He soon chuckled, realizing Fu Qing was setting rules for certain people, and promised to find the town's best carpenter for the job. He assured him it would be done perfectly, and 3 days later, the finished piece was ready for its debut. Carved from a solid piece of rosewood, the sign was placed in the most prominent position at the hotel's construction entrance. The appearance of this sign immediately caught everyone's attention, especially the workers who frequented the nearby gas station for meals. They would glance at it while passing by and smile to themselves, clearly understanding exactly who the message was intended for. Naturally, Zheng Daqian saw it too, and he knew perfectly well that non-paying guests referred to him and his distinguished companion. It was Fu Qing's most direct way of telling them that their greedy eyes were not welcome on his property, a bold move, indeed. That evening, Su Wan called with the results, identifying the man as Li Huayu, a boss known for a very specific set of skills. He specialized in finding high-value projects with hidden weaknesses or disputes, then using various tactics to force a low-price takeover. After repackaging and reselling them for massive profits, he left a trail of ruined companies in his wake. Su Wan's report was chilling. Each word made Fu Qing's heart sink a little further, and he wondered aloud how such a man could be involved with Zheng Daqian. Su Wan answered immediately, noting that an investment firm under Li Huayu's name had surfaced in official records just last month. We learned that Li Huayu had partnered with Zheng Daqian's younger brother to form a new company called Anning Konggang Company, Ltd. Su Wan then asked him to guess where the company was registered, and the realization hit Fu Qing like a physical blow. He asked if it was his own property, and Su Wan's voice turned cold as she confirmed his worst fears. It was indeed his land. Everything finally made sense, as Zheng Daqian never intended to let him live in peace. He had been excluded from the development zone specifically, so this land could be seized later, knowing its value would skyrocket. By having his brother collaborate with Li Huayu's firm, the plan was to eventually tuck this entire area into their own pockets. Fu Qing's hotel was standing directly in the way of their fortune, which is why they were using every possible tactic to drive him out. They wanted to turn his hotel into their hotel. Those previous petty tricks, it seems, were merely the appetizers. Now that the true corporate predators had entered the field, a worried Fu Qing asked Su Wan what their next move would be. Su Wan explained that Li Huayu's methods usually involve 3 steps, starting with a smear campaign to ruin his reputation. They would make him look like a liability to shake the confidence of his partners, followed by the second step, relentless legal litigation. They would use baseless lawsuits to drain his energy and capital before the final blow, cutting off his financial lifelines entirely. Fu Qing fell silent for a long time as he processed her analysis, before finally stating that if they wanted to play, he was ready. He was determined to see this through to the end, though Su Wan couldn't help but feel a flicker of concern for him. He asked her to keep a close eye on every transaction and movement between the firm and the new company to anticipate their next step. Meanwhile, he planned to finalize the partnership with Nanqing quickly, as he needed a powerful official ally to serve as his shield. Furthermore, the hotel had to be completed at top speed. Once the cash flow started, he could afford to wait them out. Hearing his resolve, Su Wan let out a long sigh of relief, remarking that he had truly grown up. He looked out the window at the sign prohibiting entry, telling himself that in a world that doesn't believe in tears, he was forced to change. To survive, he realized he had to become a warrior even more formidable than the enemies standing at his gate. The attack from the machinery factory came much faster and more fiercely than